quite jam-packed. We've got about 20 minutes of content. So if you put any questions in the chat, what I'll do is I'll try and answer them after the webinar. I'll send on the information with lots of resources and to give you some added detail, and hopefully that might answer the majority of the questions. So I think we're nearly there in terms of time-wise and numbers-wise. So I'll just give it a minute for the recording to kick in. Okay, so today's webinar is all about climate proofing your garden. So I don't really want to talk today about how to lessen the impact, how to sort of reduce climate change. I'm talking about how we can adapt to climate change. And the reason for that is because, as I'll say in a minute, we've got a certain level of warming that's going to happen to our climate already. So it's important that we are recognising that and we are making those necessary adaptations. So my name's James. I'm the Wild Campaigns Officer for Cheshire Wildlife Trust. And I've got a very interesting job that involves a lot of different things, but my job is primarily to influence people. So I influence the public. I sort of help them recognise how they can have an impact on sort of nature and the climate. I talk to our MPs and our politicians to make sure that they know how they can sort of have an impact through the laws and policies that they stand for. And then I also have the pleasure of working with our Young Leaders Group, who are a new team of young campaigners in Chester who are going to be rolling out a new city-based nature campaign over the coming months. So for me, this is all about trying to make people understand that the climate crisis and the nature crisis are one the same. So on one hand, we've got the climate warming, we've got more extreme weather events happening. On the other hand, we've got challenges to nature loss. So we've got species going extinct, we've got lots of habitat being lost. And in the sense, these are the same problem because they're caused by the same factors, losses of nature, losses of forest, things like that. But in a sense, they also have the same solutions. So helping us improve sort of the nature, restoring it to its natural sort of conditions, that's going to have a positive impact on reducing climate change and helping us adapt. So you may have seen earlier on in the week that there was this news article from the Met Office. So the Met Office has changed the definition of a heat wave in some areas. So for a heat wave to be declared in some counties now, it needs to be 1 degree higher than what it was at the start of the year. So what that sort of signifies is that we are going to be seeing more extreme weather. We're going to see warmer temperatures. Because that's not that we're going to see less heat waves. We're going to see the same amount of heat waves, just it's becoming more normal to see more warm weather. And this was very well reported in lots of different media outlets. We saw quite a lot of coverage over it. And it's sort of really sort of hitting home, I think, to the public now and sort of to our political leaders that we are going to have to do something about this. So what does the future weather forecast for the UK look like? Well, even at the current levels of warming, we are going to see changes in our weather. You may have heard a lot of politicians talking about 1.5 degrees worth of warming and trying to limit warming to that. Now, it's important to say that that's sort of the most optimistic prediction as well. It depends on how organised we are, how quickly we introduce policies to reduce our carbon output. And we could be seeing anything up to 4 degrees of warming, essentially. And it's important to recognise that that is an average. That's not just, it doesn't sound a lot, but that's average temperatures across the world rising by quite a significant amount, really. And at the moment, we're on about 1.2 degrees worth of warming. So a certain amount of warming from pre-industrial times has already taken place. And that's sort of explaining some of the weather we're seeing today. But even under sort of best case scenarios, we're still going to see a bit more of an increase, essentially, in the warming of our planet, which is going to result in more extreme weather. So even at 1.5 degrees C of warming, we're going to see at least 5 additional hot days a year. If it goes even beyond that, we can see potentially up to 39 more days of hot weather, and that's anything over 25 degrees. We're also potentially going to see more rainfall. So at 1.5 degrees C of warming, we're going to see at least 1 additional day of higher impact rainfall. If you think of some of the flooding that's been in the news over the last year or two, you can see that we are seeing more sort of flooding. And then an increase in the frequency and severity of long-term droughts. We're seeing more water shortages, which obviously puts pressure on sort of the natural environment because we're having to take more out of reservoirs and reserves, but also it sort of creates problems really in terms of sort of our own water usage, and we have hose pipe bans and things like that in the garden. So the thing that the Met Office have concluded in their report is that adaptation is going to be more important to mitigate those risks, essentially. So today's webinar, as I said, is going to be about adapting to climate change. It's not going to be about necessarily reducing the impact of it. It's going to be about how we can make changes at home that are going to help us deal with these problems. So if you picture, I guess, just to give you an example, picture the hottest day in the last 20 years. That hottest day is going to become 1 to 3 degrees warmer by 2050, and it's going to potentially become 2 to 5 degrees warmer by 2100. So we're going to see the hottest day in 20 years become even hotter, which just sort of shows how sort of extreme some of these events are going to become. And those sort of 1 in 20-year events potentially going to become as frequent as 1 in 2. So this shows that we do need to act, and obviously a lot of things we need to do we need to start doing now to make sure that they have the benefits in sort of, well, decades to come. Now the trouble is, a lot of our settlements in our urban areas exacerbate these problems. If you think about sort of the surfaces we have in our cities and our towns, they're not helpful towards these problems. So often we replace a lot of surfaces with, well, things like decking, fences. They replace plants. Like if you think fences are replacing hedges that would have been there in the past. Decking probably covers areas that would have been covered by grasslands. So that's reducing natural vegetation. If you think of paving, tiles on roofs, those are stopping water from soaking into the ground. So that's increasing sort of flooding risk. And also, dark matte surfaces tend to absorb more energy. And if you think of bricks, tarmac, typical building materials that we use, they tend to be very dark matte surfaces, which means they absorb lots of solar energy. And the problem with that is a bit like a nighttime storage heater, that they take in all that energy and then they throw it back out as heat. So not only are we going to see more extreme weather, but our urban areas are not very well equipped really to deal with this extreme weather. Now, obviously, the UK has a very sort of mild climate. We've got a temperate maritime climate, so we tend to not experience the same extreme weather that we see in other areas of the world. So other areas of the world are currently doing research in how we can sort of deal with these extremes already, because they're facing them at the moment. So the University of Melbourne have done a bit of a study. You can see the thermal image of a street there. At the top here, we've got lots of walls and surfaces covered by plants and vegetation. And at the bottom, we can see all sort of the exposed part of the street, which is in direct sunlight. And you can see sort of the temperature here of those different areas, and that the vegetated areas, the bits covered by plants, are far cooler than the bits that are exposed directly to the sun. And this sort of offers a bit of a hint as to what we can do to sort of deal with these extreme temperatures that actually our natural sort of spaces and our natural sort of vegetation can provide a bit of cooling in a sense. And the University of the University of Arizona have done a bit of a study into this, and they've said that potentially those plants can lower surface temperatures by 11 to 25 degrees, and that subsequently lowers the air temperature by 1 to 5 degrees C. So what we can start to see there is that nature, in a way, is helping us provide a bit of a solution to help keep us cool and tackle some of these extreme weather problems. So the more vegetation we have, essentially, the more we're going to be able to deal with these sort of extreme weather events. So how do trees and plants keep us cool? Well, there's sort of two sides to this, really. First of all, shading, that's probably the more obvious one. If you think of a big tree canopy, it's shading potentially man-made surfaces. So rather than the sunlight all hitting those directly and all that energy being soaked up and heating up, those trees can obviously shade the surfaces, dissipate that energy through photosynthesis and things like that. Then also, in similar way to like we sweat to keep cool, trees give off water, well, through evapotranspiration, they help them cool down. So water from the trees and plants is evaporated, and in that process of transforming that from a liquid to a gas, some of that energy is expended essentially. So that reduces warming and keeps areas cool. So that's why we see sort of natural sort of spaces providing sort of cooler temperatures rather than sort of our urban man-made ones. So what can we do? So obviously that's going through a lot of the problems, and it's important to say that today this is about how we can adapt. So the good news is there are things we can do at home. Obviously we want to see reductions in carbon emissions, and that's important, and we've got to make sure we are still advocating for that. But we can also make sure that we are preparing for these extreme events, because as I said, some degrees of warming are going to be happening, even if at the best case scenario. So one simple solution is to grow climbing plants. Now, the objective of this is to probably cover all those sort of surfaces that are in direct sunlight, that man-made, that would normally soak up loads of energy and give it off as heat, with climbing plants, because they're going to reduce sort of the temperatures that are produced from those. So some loads of different plants you can go for here. I've suggested for you here dog rose, ivy, honeysuckle, jasmine, clematis. The fantastic thing about these is they're going to provide habitats for wildlife as well. and provide a food source. And if you think of all the nectar provided by these plants and flowers, what you're going to see is obviously a benefit to the climate in terms of cooling your house down if you put it against the wall. But also you're going to be providing a fantastic source of food for wildlife. And it's important to also, I think, point out the honeysuckle here as well. So honeysuckle is the food plant of the white admiral, which is a high conservation priority butterfly. It's typically found in the south of the UK, but obviously as temperatures warm, we're going to start seeing species move further north. So probably what we need to start doing as well is thinking about how we can prepare our gardens in a way for some of the southern species to move further north as they try and seek out those cooler temperatures. So I think the white admiral was spotted in Cheshire. It's quite rare to see it this far north, but what it has been spotted in Cheshire in Macclesfield in someone's garden. So it just goes to show that you could be providing habitat for sort of a climate refugee insect in a way. And another thing, perhaps a bit more in keeping with what we'd associate with climate change, is to grow hedges. So if you can replace your fences with your natural native sort of hedge plants, then that's also going to help in terms of reducing sort of the temperatures in your garden. But also, this also has the added benefit of like reducing flooding risks in sort of wetter months. So your beech, your hawthorn, your blackthorn, holly, hornbeam, all fantastic hedging plants. And obviously your hawthorn and your blackthorn produce a fantastic white blossom in the spring. So really visually appealing hedges to have in your garden. And also the beech, I think this is probably my favourite, produces those fantastic vivid autumnal colours. So it's really sort of a nice way of sort of changing your garden and helping it adapting the seasons as well. And it's important to say that obviously we think of fences in terms of panels, but if you do need that added bit of security to your garden, you need it fenced off, you can still go for like a wire fence or a chain fence or post and rails, something that's still going to fence the garden, and you can grow plants then through those. So it's important to say that you don't need to get rid of it entirely, but it might be just worth changing sort of the fence you have to accommodate more hedges. And the other thing as well is to think about the length of your lawn. So a short mown lawn is going to heat up a lot quicker and be a lot drier than a lawn that's a lot longer. So this is actually my garden. So this is what I inherited on the left. So I inherited very much a garden that was short mown and baked dry in the summer months. And this is what I eventually turned it into. Now, I'm assuming some people might want to need to entirely garden than me. I'm very much a wildlife enthusiast. I want to see as much wildlife in there as possible. So every space goes to wildlife. But it sort of illustrates a couple of points here that at the back, I've got some very long grass here. Move back for some reason there. There we go. So that's obviously shading sort of the ground. It's reducing water loss from the ground, and it's going to provide a bit of cooler temperatures there. I've actually got a wildflower meadow at the front here, providing lots of sort of native habitat for insects as well. And it's important to say that the difference I saw from that to that, this is just 2 years. I saw so many different insects about. I saw ladybirds, grasshoppers, I saw butterflies, and loads of hedgehogs, loads of birds come to my garden as a result of making those changes. So it's providing a habitat for wildlife, also helping adapt to sort of the impacts of climate change. And this is it in early spring. Well, no, actually late spring, I think that was. But you can see sort of my neighbour's garden, very sort of, we've done it again, dry and parched in the background, whereas I've got this very lush green sort of almost semi-natural meadow here with loads of buttercups. So you can see sort of the difference that that sort of longer grass can have. And probably also to point out a couple of more things here. I've got a wire fence here. This is where loads of sort of climbing plants are growing over there. I've got some hedging plants as well in there, providing lots of shelter. This is going to keep the garden cool. You can also see that there's this horrible sort of metal container that my neighbour has, which loads of sort of climbing plants are growing over sort of the face of that now, so it's not going to heat up in the sun that as much now. And obviously, nice sort of shading from a tree there. And then I can't take credit for this one, but if you look at the neighbour at the back, they've got a massive load of ivy growing up that sort of very sunlit wall. So that's going to be keeping their house very cool in summer, and also probably providing a little bit of insulation for them in the winter as well. So probably worth thinking about with the energy crisis going on. And the other thing I suppose we need to think is how we can sort of have a water source in your garden. Because as I said, that evaporation process helps cool things down. So one thing you can do is have a pond in your garden. It produces a great habitat for wildlife. It's also going to help give wildlife drinking water in the summer months in those drought conditions, and also provide those sort of cooler places for them to sort of rest. And then if you are an avid gardener, you probably also want to install a water butt if you haven't already. So that's a great way of balancing out sort of those high rainfall times with those very, very dry conditions. So you're not using natural water. And that's obviously going to reduce pressure on reservoirs, which means we've got more water, obviously, in the natural environment. Now, the one I've probably not talked about as much is sort of flooding. So a really fantastic idea that's sort of it's gained gained a bit of traction in the US, and it's come from there, is the idea of a rain garden. And it's kind of what it says on the tin. It's a garden that sort of stores rainwater temporarily and then lets it naturally drain back in at a later sort of date. So here you see on sort of the left a very natural rain garden. It's a bowl shape in someone's lawn essentially, and that fills up during sort of high rainfall. And it also produces some amazing habitat for wildlife through the plants that you can grow there. So that water will naturally drain back into the ground. Some of it will be soaked up by the plants, some of it will evaporate. But the important thing is it's not putting pressure on our sort of storm drains, because it's sort of diverting water from an impermeable surface into a natural surface. And now, obviously, everyone doesn't have a big lawn, so you can do this on a sort of a smaller scale with a rain garden planter. Again, it's the same sort of process, taking water from an impermeable surface, and rather than have it go straight to the drain, it delays its time before it goes into there through passing through the planter, and some of that gets taken out by plants and evaporation. So how do you make a rain garden? Well, it's a bit of a long process, I suppose, but it's worth doing because, as I said, this can really sort of help us adapt to these sort of high rainfall events. What you want to do is find a spot at least 3 meters away from your house, keeping it away so you've got enough space for it to drain. It needs good drainage and sunlight. It's not worth putting it in an area that gets very frequently waterlogged, because you're just going to exacerbate the problems there. And then you need to sort of make sure it's the right size. So if you think of your house, if you live in, say, a detached house that has 4 downspouts from your gutters, what each is going to be taken away is about a quarter of your roof surface area. So you then need to figure out about 20% of that, and that's going to be the right size for your rain garden. So what you can then do is dig a bowl that's about 30 centimeters deep. That'll allow it to accommodate some of that water and in the rainfall event. And what you can do is take some of that material that you've dug out, put it around the edges to build up a slightly higher, so it creates that bowl shape and allows it to fill up. You then want to fill it with sand, compost, and gravel, and that'll help improve the drainage back into the soil so that can seep naturally into the groundwater. So, important to say that you need to make sure that there is some sort of drainage away from this, because if it does fill up, you need somewhere for it to go. So it's got to be connected to somewhat the drain. You could even connect it to a pond, but bear in mind that if that fills up as well, you've got to divert it somewhere. So it's good to make sure that there is a natural drain for it to run into. And then also, you want to make sure that there is rocks around the entrance and the exit, so that that compost and the sand is not going to get eroded and washed away. And then you obviously want to put a range of sort of plants in there as well. Now, these plants need to be adapted well to the wet conditions, but also the dry conditions, because it's important to say that a rain garden sounds like it's going to be wet all the time. It isn't. It's only going to be wet during those rainfall days. So you need to have plants that are going to tolerate both dry conditions and wet conditions. So that sort of limits what you can go for. For the planter, it's a slightly different process, but there's some very similar principles. So what you need is, again, a spot near a downs pipe, essentially, for the planter. You then need a large planter that's going to have a waterproof lining, so you can add a waterproof lining to it pretty easily. So that means it will hold the water, it's not going to leak. At the bottom, you're going to need a slotted pipe, and that's so the water is going to mimic that natural process that it would do in the other, as it did in the other rain garden. It would seep through the ground naturally and go into groundwater. Here it's seeping through all the sand compost mix, and then it would naturally go into the sort of that pipe there, which replicates the groundwater moving. What you do after that is you need to make sure that there is a drainage sort of source for this to go into. Obviously, the plant is going to be on an impermeable surface likely, so it needs to go into a drain. And then you make sure you've got a layer of gravel to help that water pass into it, but it needs to be covered by a porous sort of textile material. So basically that's to stop obviously the sand and the compost that you're putting in there from passing into the pipe and then draining out, because we don't want that or seep out as well. And then, yeah, similar thing, you can have your native plants in the top that need to be adapted to sort of wet and dry conditions. And it's worth saying you could actually have a series of planters. It doesn't have to all drain out into the drain straight away. You could have an overflow here that could lead into a second planter, depending on how much space you've got. So I suppose the last thing to sort of add really is what sort of plants should you put in your rain garden? Well, it's important to think of those wet and dry tolerant plants. So here are sort of 6 that you could put in there. You've got your yellow flag iris, your purple loosestrife, your bistorch, your meadowsweet, primrose, and hemp agrimony, all fantastic native plants that are going to be very tolerant to those conditions. I think I'd always recommend you try and put native plants in there because, as I said, they provide food plants for sort of our native insects. So particularly butterflies, if you want to encourage butterflies in your garden, it's always good to be going for those. So I hope really that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the things you can do to reduce sort of temperatures in your garden, help them keep cool, help save water, but also help cope with flooding. So I think it's important to say that these actions, they do add up. Obviously, in an urban area, these are going to have much more impact than perhaps in a rural area. But obviously, the more people get taking action, the more we're going to see sort of a collective sort of impact of them. So if I can ask you to do anything today, it's that do one of these at least, and maybe try and get someone else to do one as well, because the more people we have doing this, the more it's going to have an impact. So very much thank you for listening today. As I said, if you've missed anything here and is something you perhaps not quite got, you'll be able to watch this back in a recording, and I'll also be sending on lots of resources to give you more details and more information on how you can do some of these things. And yeah, thank you for all your questions that have come through as well. Any of those I will be answering after, and I'll send those on. So thank you very much for attending today, and good luck with creating one of these things in your garden.